diving into greater futures with Anab Jain. So Anab Jain brings the future to life, creating experiences where people can touch, see, and feel the potential of the world we're creating. Together with Jon Arden, she co-founded the London-based office Superflux with the mission to translate future uncertainty into present-day choices. Their work has been exhibited at major institutions from New York to London to Dublin to Japan to Australia to Belgium, France, Poland, Germany, Austria, and Italy, where they actually should have been part of the Architecture Biennale, which should have opened, I think, last week, and where they would have contributed to the discussions on how to live together. Superflux also, of course, received numerous awards, like from the ICSID, UNESCO, Geneva Human Rights Festival, Apple Computers, and the UK government's Innovation Department. And in addition to all that, Anab Jain, a designer, futurist, and filmmaker, is also the professor for design investigations here at the Angewandte. So her investigations address issues of climate change, biotechnology, the unprecedented power of algorithmic surveillance, and the emergence of artificial intelligence, as well as the city and its infrastructure. And I think that the range of this design work reflects the state in which current societies unfold and discloses the consequent challenges, but also opportunities projected onto the design professions. In today's lecture, she will talk about imagining plural futures at the intersection of climate crisis, technology, and more than human politics. So to keep it brief, Anab, thank you very much for taking the time and being with us.
Thank you, Maja.
And I'm very happy to hand over my screen to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Maja. Thanks, everyone, for being here, taking time out. I know everyone has got a lot of Zoom fatigue, so really appreciate your time. I'm just going to share my screen. So basically, Maja's done the introduction, and I wanted to kind of quickly say that you could find a lot of my work and my practice and projects with my partner John through our websites. I'm not going to go through a lot of our projects. You can see the work of our students at designinvestigations.at, series of different projects, diploma student projects and current projects. They're all there. So I'm just going to dive into some of the things that I'm thinking about right now, rather than kind of hang around on different projects. So calling this talk on critical activism and fungal revolts. This is a talk I gave last year at the Tentacular Festival, but it somehow feels increasingly relevant. And so I'm going to kind of talk about it. I'm going to start by talking about my colonial histories, because I think a lot about futures, and there are no futures without histories. And so this is a painting of a revolt known as the Revolt or the Mutiny of 1857, as my Indian history books will say. 150 years ago, it seemed like these things were so unheard of that you could have a revolt and simply call it the revolt. It was a story about a brave soldier called Mangal Pandey who started a mutiny against the British colonial Raj, and in 1857, but it took about 90 years after that single revolt for millions of other small micro-revolutions before India and Pakistan finally got independence. Our colonial histories are dark and murky, but what seems clear is that it takes years of belief, rebellion, and constant hope for millions of people to lead to that moment of freedom. Revolutions are slow and revolutions are dark, but revolutions shape futures. And while my history is overwhelmingly dominated by a very clear revolution, if I look all around me, it seems like what is my revolt? What is our revolt? What are we fighting? It's not one single thing. Yes, it is the virus, but it is also algorithmic privacy or climate crisis or ecological crisis. It seems that today the enemy is amorphous, complex, messy, plural, and faceless. Mm-hmm. And while I say that we don't have a clear enemy and there is no clear revolt, if we listen to 97% of the scientists out there, are epidemiologists now, we know that there's an undeniable urgency for a very different kind of politics of hope and critical activism. But things are so complex and increasingly entangled that it is very difficult to identify where one can start making a start or a headway. This is a recent film we made for the Vienna Museum's exhibition called The Future Starts Now Here. And it's basically a film that attempts to connect the complex ecologies. Right, does that work?
I think now it should. I think you just...
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so this is quite a long film. I'm not going to kind of get into to all of the film, but it's quite good to show that some of the aspects of this film, because it is an attempt to show how something that is as simple as a machine that you look into, the kind of glowing rectangle in our hands that pulls us into this kind of abyss, the virtual space. The machine that helps you create cute animal videos and emojis sucks you into it for a long time. You're flicking, liking, moving on constantly between places across cities and countries and continents. It's a kind of a journey that traverses not just kind of the home and the workspace in the city, but across cities to a sort of a more overview of a planetary scale technological infrastructure that is deeply connected through what we call the mobile phone device. So every aspect of every byte of our data is mined, from your pocket to the planet, give you recommendations of things that you've liked before. And we kind of start to see how this starts taking a cultish form, this kind of digital technological infrastructural landscape. These kind of fervorous, kind of revered, kind of almost hypnotic behavior from large tech companies, this kind of, this is the CEOs of Microsoft, these kind of tech cult waves, as if it's become a kind of religion. In that state of reverence, you start zooming out, you fly high, become a drone. You own the sky. You become a worker making algorithms work for 0.87 cents a task per turker. And then we went into these kind of server farms, exploring the underbelly of the internet, seeing where these large farms are now, where the Earth's landscape is being terraformed, looking at mechanical turkers and the kind of jobs that they do, all the way down to the creation of entirely new realms of data, and how your faces are mined for all these kind of values that are then placed against you. We've seen the kind of rise of Cambridge Analytica, and we went further looking at self-driving cars, looking at LiDAR landscapes, self-driving cars, the phenomenon of Bitcoin mining, which is also taking up large portions of technological infrastructure, but also electricity, positioning themselves near water supplies. So these boundaries between our technological infrastructure and our natural, what we call natural or planetary scale infrastructure, is blending and merging. And then we move, further to other parts of the planet, zooming in to the places where these things are being built, the factories where this mindless amount of work is being done, and then all the way to the very place where these minerals are being mined, the landscapes where the very thing that we own in our hands, hold in our hands, comes from. So you become the machine, you slowly realize that you are in a way becoming the machine who owns your face. This kind of cobalt mining, extremely fragile, vulnerable landscapes start blending into our own faces as we realize that all of us are become part of these kind of the tools that we are trying to create to change the world are in fact reconfiguring us. And this kind of a complexity, this kind of scale of complexity is very kind of central to our practice, that we are not trying to isolate kind of different silos of expertise or areas, because we find that we are increasingly connected. Just a glimpse of some of the projects we do. We grapple some of these complexities and create kind of experiences, cautionary tales, superfictions that aim to simulate different possible futures. By bringing these naughty worlds into the present, we are hoping that people can emotionally engage with some of these complex challenges that we face today. And the reason we do some of this work is because there is a really strong culture of measuring instruments that measure and kind of predict futures that has taken over the popular landscape. So this idea of the graph, which was actually the curve, which kind of puts everything into a pattern and omits anything that falls out of that pattern, or that line is left out of it. And so things get simplified and complexities are removed. And we feel that in any sort of present, past or future, basic complexities need to be understood and tackled. So I see this as a problem of what we might call capitalism or modernism, which was an unquestioning pursuit of a better, quote unquote, better future. These kind of methodologies of mapping, designing, planning, or controlling, changing deeply complex systems may not be the answers to the challenges we face. And maybe we need to go underground. Maybe we need to look at mycelial arrangements of cosmopolitan cities underground to understand how we might move forward. And so some of the things that we try and surface with the people we work with, whether they are clients or commercial organizations or cultural institutions, is to talk about two other practices. It is not just the strategic and the kind of measuring instruments that matter, but the affect theory, or the emotions or the feelings of how we interpret and engage with complexity matters. And Antonio Damasio writes about it in Era, Emotion, Reason, and the Human Brain, that emotions and feelings are not a luxury. They're not a means of communicating our states of mind to others, but they are also a way of guiding our own judgments and decisions, that emotions bring the body into a loop of reason. And if you look at some of the biggest reasons why Donald Trump continues to have such a level of following, despite absolutely ridiculous kind of blasphemous things that come off his mouth, essentially is because he has constructed this narrative which completely ties people with the kind of core bottom of their emotions. Some of the projects that we do, I just want to give a quick glimpse of something we did a few years ago, but relevant today increasingly, as we have drones that are now flying over some parts of Italy, measuring people's body temperatures to see whether they have any fever or not. And a few years ago, we were looking at this kind of autonomous, the idea of autonomy or agency in machines, and chose to work with drones because we were interested in what it means to have something that has the power and that vantage point to see things we can't see, to go places we can't see, and to do so with increasing autonomy. When we started building and constructing a lot of these machines in our studio to understand what are the challenges of such technology. So really getting hands-on, understanding the materiality of the technology is really important to our practice. Some of the drones we will, including this one, which is known as the Night Watchman, which is controlling and patrolling the neighborhood. If you look at it, it flies about, tagging people, logging their database, constantly making note of people who are doing things they shouldn't be doing, like for instance, these boys playing in the no ball game area and marking them as statutory nuisances, and so on. Or you have this kind of giant flying advertising drone that is kind of flashing bespoke advertising based on your social media preferences, because it is capable of that level of facial recognition. So you are out in the city, and it is not just tagging and recognizing your every move, but it's like, okay, how does it know that I want to make a trip, and why is it advertising Ryanair to me? And I think this is important because as architects, your work for the architecture students specifically is not just limited to the object of the physical space anymore. And that these are some of the things we were thinking, that what might be the cartographies of the sky, what might be new levels of kind of spatial movement and flow across our cities when we have to keep such new agents in mind. So and we were doing this because we realized that facial recognition, for instance, is everywhere. So this is not so much a fiction, but it's a reality. And whether you are looking at an advertisement or you're attending a protest, these technologies are here, and we don't really know, by and large, how they're being used and to what purpose. And some of the other things that really have kind of been at the forefront of our practice for the last few years is looking at climate change or global warming, whatever you might call it, this kind of, again, a graph of the global landmass temperature index by NASA. So we've been looking at data and projections like this and realized that it is quite hard to imagine the unsurmountable amount of problems that all of us are likely to face, and that most people in their everyday lives are at a loss of how to make sense of such graphs. As Timothy Morton says, we have built computing systems that can model climate in real time, but our regular common sense perception cannot compute terabytes of global climate information or kind of sense nanosecond timescales. Most mornings, I can't even find my coffee grinder. And he kind of coined a term for this kind of complex object that he calls hyperobjects. Hyperobjects are kind of phenomena like radioactive materials and global warming. Hyperobjects stretch our ideas of time and space. Since they far outlast human timescales, or they are massively distributed in terrestrial space and therefore unavailable to immediate experience. So when we were thinking about some of these things, we really wanted to zoom in, and this is a big speculative graph that's hard to read, around food and food insecurity, because we were interested in that very tangible thing that we will all experience, which is food insecurity or food shortage. And it was very clear that by 2050, the food consumption is likely to increase from 32 kilos today to 52 kilos. But we are likely to face a real kind of devastating effect of climate change on our food crops and our food assets. So based on such projections and working with the scientists at the UK Met Office, as well as scientists at NASA, we explored a scenario where the one possible future where the Western world has moved from abundance to scarcity. We imagine living in a future city with repeated flooding, periods with almost no food in supermarkets, economic instabilities, and broken supply chains. Kind of a bit like when a virus turns life into, pretty much a kind of present day scenario in many ways. That was unexpected. But the questions that we were asking were, what can we do to not just survive, but prosper in such a world? And what food can we eat? To really get inside these questions, once again, we were doing a ton of live prototyping. We started exploring the possibilities of transforming our homes into spaces of food production, gaining hands-on knowledge about new and emerging ways of growing food. So we started building food computers from scratch. That's John there trying to use the technique of fog phonics. So just fog, no water or soil, to grow things quickly. And we also wanted to build them in the cheapest way and most accessible way possible, literally trying to turn today's waste into tomorrow's dinner. This is a glimpse of some of our early experiments with John and our son Arlo. And we were really thinking about what might a 6-year-old find themselves in 2050? What home would they be living in? So that was kind of an emotional driver for our work, actually. And the final outcome of the work took the form of an installation which transported people into a London apartment, perhaps around 2050 or so. At first glance, a seemingly comfortable living space designed for a world of automated living, global trade, and material abundance, but then on closer inspection and realization that the apartment has been adapted to a future it was never meant to inhabit. Discarded newspapers and a radio show reflect the tensions in this world. A spout panel constantly asking the fridge for milk, but where is the milk in this future? Amongst the detritus of now obsolete smart devices and designer goods lives a new reality formed by the impact of climate change. Recipes in the kitchen reflect the change in food production, consumption, and storage. Experimental food production now occupies space once given to relaxation, transforming the apartment into a space for growing and producing food. Resourcefully hacked together consumer items, IKEA shelves, decorative fog makers, computer fans, programmable microcontrollers, plumbing supplies, LED lamps, fog oozing out of these contraptions, blinding purple light, droning sounds of water pipes, snares, foxskin, and mycelium, all bearing fruit in the blasted ruins of capitalism. Looking beyond, there lies a city, familiar yet alien. Over 100,000 visitors came to the apartment at CCCB, where it lived for a few months in Barcelona. This is not a prediction nor a render. The intention of such a speculative approach with hands-on experimentation was that it became a familiar space to confront our fears, but also concrete ways to show the concrete ways in which we can mitigate the shock of climate change. So if our work becomes a catalyzing force for people to imagine things they might not have been able to imagine otherwise, that's powerful. And for me, that's a slow form of slow activism. What's important to say that this work is not a one-off, but more like a work in progress. We showed the second episode of this at the Art Science Museum right now. It's still ongoing, curated by Anna Aga and Adrian George. It's a HBD, the Housing Development Apartment of Singapore, set around the second half of the mid-21st century, so like 2060s or so on. But this time we wanted to move away from this reliance on the foghornics and the technology and use even simpler techniques to grow food, because we were interested in applying, and so we started applying the principles of permaculture, of circular farming, of reuse of waste, of companion planting, and soil health as part of a permanent indoor agricultural system, in a situation where outdoor farming may not be such an option. And so the home slowly started becoming much more of a multi-species microcosm. Rather than growing systems on the periphery, you are living through and amongst them. The other thing we started doing was to meticulously handcraft tools for gathering, capturing, snaring, consuming, and growing food. So spears made from discarded Arduino circuit boards and whittled bamboo started finding their place in this new home. And these were the Arduino boards that we had used for our foggers in the first version of mitigation of shock. So there's a kind of a circular story around them. And looking out, you can see a very different, very humid Singapore. While extreme weather conditions and economic uncertainty have changed the world as we know it, it is the sheer ingenuity of the inhabitants, their tools, their artifacts, plants, and new ways of living tell a hopeful story of adaptation taken to prosper in a post-climate change future. The thing is, with global warming, the current political landscape feels extremely polarized. It is either denial that global warming exists or is a hoax led by one who shall not be named, or complete apocalypse, like AKA the end of the world. But as we swing between this doom and denial, we are stuck in what Lauren Berlant calls a state of impasse. a moment where existing social imaginaries and practices no longer produce the outcomes they once did, but no new imaginaries or practices have yet been created. Philosopher Isabel Stengers writes how such a state of impasse is actively produced by the managers of the status quo, or the guardians. These guardians actively work to produce a situation where it becomes impossible to imagine anything other than the status quo. And Stengers continues, when choices are presented by guardians, they are infernal choices, a series of non-choices presented as choices to the various publics. So for instance, the choice between doing nothing about climate change or geoengineering the climate, a choice about doing nothing about deforestation, or the choice to trade forests as commodities in order to preserve their value. This production of two bad alternatives, where one is less bad than the other, is a means by which the guardians make problems inaccessible to anyone but themselves. And so a cold panic and impotent fear of the future sets in, functionally demobilizing people. So the question that we ask in our practice is, how do we resist the gravitational pull of the impasse and deflect these invisible forces of power? How do we imagine different worlds within the current political landscape? And with our practice and works like mitigation of shock, we want to write stories of extreme adaptation emerging in precarity and thriving in the blasted ruins of capitalism. It may be the end of the world as we know it, but other worlds are possible. And of course, this idea of creating experiential futures sounds great. It's actually quite an uphill battle. We find that the desire to package the futures, into neat solutions and roadmaps is overwhelmingly strong. And people really can't stop, not but jump to conclusions. And they see the future either as a prediction or are completely dismissive of it as it doesn't align with that ideological worldview. But today we are at an interesting point. Today, post-COVID, there is this idea of the Overton window. And so far, we've always kind of held on to that middle circle, which is, whatever is the popular consensus reality, whatever is acceptable. But today, with COVID, what was considered impossible a few months ago, where a third of the world has come to a standstill, is now part of the possible realm. And so I just want to take you into one possible alternate view of thinking about this, which was previously unthinkable. Because being open to uncertainty is not, like a quote or a meme or something. It's an actual practice. And I think as all of us critical thinkers, designers and makers, it is our kind of responsibility to be able to hold multiple possibilities simultaneously and start to see the connections between these possibilities. So one of the things that I was talking about in terms of the shifts was to start thinking today is moving past the human anthropocentrism. So, as Anne Galloway says, what if we deny that human beings are exceptional? What if we stop listening and speaking only to ourselves? And I'm really drawn to that because few years ago when we were doing mitigation of shock, these are these kind of mushrooms that bloomed in our studio. But these were mushrooms that we had actually completely forgotten about because they refused to do what we really wanted them to do. So these were the early days when we were trying to grow them in this kind of, a DIY clad chamber with, aquaponics and a fruiting chamber and ultrasonic fog to control the humidity and whatnot. And for so long, nothing happened. Nothing seemed to happen. But then they began to find their right environment, or rather, our human activities and disturbances, both planned and unplanned, had created the optimum conditions for them to grow into these beautiful and rather delicious forms. And I realized then that our work had given it, like we are used to growing stuff and, all of that, but still had given birth to new forms of relationships. As designers, we are so caught up in the idea of producing the final product as something that is tangible. But what if it is not something that, what if it doesn't stop growing? What if it isn't something that is a static object? Of course, foresters grow trees and farmers grow wheat, but within our world of design, we still not engaging with this idea of nurture and growing, and focusing on the artifact rather than the organism. For me, this kind of slow epiphany drew me into the world of many interacting species. It provides a really powerful vantage point to know ourselves as participants in a more complex human and non-human relationships. In Staying with the Trouble-Making Kin in Thylacine, Donna Haraway offers yet another such perspective where she favors de-emphasizing the human exceptionalism in favor of multi-specialism. And what for me this means is that it helps us move beyond quick fixes, because we know that every fix has a consequence, that everything is connected to everything else, that we become open to the strange and the unknown, the ambiguous and the uncertain, the weird and the provisional. And so taking from all of these things, I start to kind of think about how we might be able to kind of take a different perspective on our politics of care. So, if we start to see the self not as an individual hero, but as one among many, human and non-human, a new kind of tentacular, multi-kind, multi-species politics of care might emerge. A politics which does not rely on oppositional, binary, artificially constructed worldviews, one that is not obfuscated by the right and the left, or the neoliberals and the communists, or whatever it is that you choose to follow. But a politics that gives a new kind of relational agency to help us imagine alternatives for living with and through global warming. A politics which gives us an opportunity to invent new practices of more than human care, humility, imagination, interdependence, resistance, revolt, repair, and mourning. And so this is my kind of first attempt at a kind of a more than human field guide of sorts, if you like, the start of an A-B list that moves from more human to more than human politics, and it's not to say that we disown the A list, but rather we start to think about what the B list brings to us, from systems to assemblages, from nodes to knots, from extinction to precarity, where you understand life is precarious, that social existence depends on the interdependence and care of others. From innovation, where we are just talking about adding and growing, to resurgence, where we start talking about restoring and regenerating. From global to terrestrial, from producing to endangering. And, from Kim Stanley Robinson's idea of moving from the idea of the Anthropocene to the dithering, a state of indecisive agitation. It feels like perhaps more suited to where we are today, the dithering. And that's where I kind of feel we are at. It's a time to acknowledge the limits of our anthropocentric capitalism and embrace the burden of a world that is more precarious. And we have to use kind of our deep resourcefulness and imagination to stay with the trouble and keep the revolt alive. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There would be a big clap now, obviously, if we would be physically together. Thank you very much for a wonderful run through a lot of very, I would say, interesting, inspiring idea. Thank you also for all the positive. Still, although staying with the trouble, I guess staying affirmative with it and staying positive with it is probably where you might somehow also agree with. Just to the audience, I would like to say that please, I think we have still a few minutes for questions. Anna, is that right?
Sure.
So if anybody would like to jump in, just turn off the mic and give us a short cough, and we will know that somebody is ready to get into the conversation. When maybe I just make a first. It's not even so much a question, that it's maybe a comment that I am interested in a segue, in your opinion about, and it goes about your interest in the more than human politics, right? And I wonder, you know, the term human, there is also someone like Rossi Braidotti who wonderfully explained how the term human in itself is a problematic concept, that it has never been inclusive, it has never been neutral in terms of you know, politics and everything. So, and then again, it's us humans who make all of these terrible things around. So I wonder which part of the human is worth preserving, or your work is trying to promote, maybe even.
Yeah. I don't think when I challenge human exceptionalism, I mean get rid of humans at all. I'm just trying to acknowledge what it means to be human in a more than human world. Mm-hmm. So it is to put the humans within the more than human world is what does it mean for me to be human in a more than human world, then rather what does it mean to be human in this world? Mm-hmm. Which is the general kind of way we've kind of operated. And I kind of, if you start thinking about it in this way, it's, you know, like what Robin Wall Kimmerer writes, you know, that she was doing a class with the students who were all writers, and she was asking them, to write something about, the earth, you love the earth, don't you? And, you know, the earth loves you back as well. And they were all just like frozen, like, how can you say that? You know, how do you know that? And then she kind of flipped it on her head and said, but what if the earth loved you back? And it's that kind of relationship that, we tend to talk about nature, and then we talk about us, and we want to go close to nature as if we are outside of nature. Mm-hmm. And what if we do not consider ourselves as outside of nature? So it's that kind of relationship.
Mm-hmm. So I have a question here which was written, if that's okay, and I can just actually read it out. And I think the question goes kind of to the key stakeholders that you're trying to address with your work.
Yeah, who are you targeting? I'm not targeting anyone. That sounds a bit warlike. I think multiple stakeholders. I mean, a lot of this work is so we've had a surprising amount of people get in touch recently that, having been to the Barcelona apartment, they have been better able to cope with the pandemic and the lockdown, because so it is not to say that there is this one person. I mean, we work a lot with kind of in the recent past with some government bodies who we want them to make better policy decisions. So certainly it will depend on who you're talking to, but a lot of this work is also bringing counter narratives and putting them on the table. Like, if you're talking about climate change in a certain way, to make that more visceral and tangible and putting it out there for people to experience. So not everything is a very defined kind of quote unquote target. Mm-hmm.
Right. I think they came even a response to a response to the question. But also, I think for Dr. Bast was having a conversation with Wolf Prix, the architect, about the future. And I think last week, I think you're also at some point gonna enter this discussion, right? Yeah. And just because, you know, we are at the Architectural Institute, and I think that a lot of critique often comes to the poor choices of architects, and who were supposed to build the environment we live in. And Wolf Prix has a quite right answer that there is a certain not inefficiency, but there's only so much that actually architects can do. I think there is even like a statistic which is kind of halfway right, probably, that 5% of the built world gets actually built by architects. The rest is developers and just people who have the actual means to raise up our built environment in a certain way. So, but I do see that there is a change and a real desire also within the architectural profession to kind of open it up. And I think that that's in a certain way, I would say almost that I see the potential that your work has, right? That it becomes accessible, that certain problems somehow become these complex problems, become more accessible to people. And it seems you find ways how to make future, or even the present probably, more accessible to wider audiences.
I think it depends. Yeah, definitely. I think it depends. In this particular project that I've shown, there was definitely an interest in this kind of, you open the door and you are into the space, and you are. There is nowhere is the word climate change mentioned, but you are able to connect the dots to your own life. And for us, it is in this particular case, because we're doing something at the moment that is a lot more symbolic, or kind of in the fantasy space as well. But in this particular case, it felt important to be able to take people almost with their hands up to a point where it felt familiar. Mm-hmm. And that it is when they enter the door of the apartment, initially it feels very familiar. They see things that they might see otherwise, in order to then start looking and saying, okay, why is there a cookbook called Pets as Protein? Or, what are they talking on the radio about? Or, it is that slow kind of piecemeal opening up of the feature, or a particular feature, so that they get time to engage and piece those evidences, to those fragments together for their own, form their own kind of worldview around this. And it is to show that you are in this, you're stood in it, you are kind of in a very embodied way experiencing this. So it's not a VR headset, or it's not a PowerPoint presentation. It's a different tool or an instrument. But there is also an artistic endeavor in trying to do something that is more exploratory and doesn't have immediate answers. Today it has become so evident that there are no answers. We really don't know what lies ahead. Those who say they know are lying. Nobody really knows. And I think if we can learn to stay with that not knowing for a bit, it might actually be quite helpful.
Hi, I would also have a question, Christoph.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks for a great talk. I have two questions relating to James Lovelock. The one is, to what extent do you base your thinking on Gaia and his concept of Earth being a living organism? And the other question, I'm fascinated with your concept of modern human, terms and tasks, so to speak, modern human. His latest book deals with the Anthropocene being replaced by the Novacene, and the question of new beings that emerge from existing AI systems, and that those beings will be as dependent on the health of the planet as we are. And I wonder, because you did a lot with new technologies, including AI, what your thinking is in this regard. But don't forget about the Gaia concept as well.
Yes. John was very influenced by James Lovelock's work way back in 2006. He was looking at the post kind of apocalypse future. Definitely, James Lovelock's thinking has influenced our work. Recent book by Bruno Latour on climate politics and or Earth Climate project is challenging some of Lovelock's concepts, and I'm taking it all in. I'm not necessarily taking a position on whether the Gaia theory is better or Latour's theory is better. What we are interested in is in a way exactly what happens when we talk to climate scientists. Like when you talk to a climate scientist who believes in the El Nino system of climate changes happening in the planet versus the other one, which I can't even remember right now, they have differing views. So as soon as that kind of the can of worms opens, you realize there is really no consensus even within the scientific community of where we stand. So in a way, what becomes interesting for us is how do we navigate these different strands of thinking that are so complex and so diverging in order to kind of zoom in into a particular world to kind of give a glimpse of what it could be. So I think to that extent influenced quite a bit. The Novacene book is interesting. I mean, it's exciting. He's still going. Like James Lovelock is still writing crazy books, which is great. I mean, I'm not particularly drawn to that kind of Novacene story as such, but I am definitely would put AI and kind of agents, software or code or objects or machines which have increasing sentience within the more than human thing. We are, it is a spectrum. It is within the spectrum. And I think it's really exciting and interesting to see what is that level of sentience. Having done some work with AI researchers, it feels still very much like a dream that this kind of general intelligence, artificial intelligence, where you have some level of quite palpable sentience is still a long way off, but certainly very interesting.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There was one more question from Mark.
I just wanted to read it, yes. So he's asking, how would we position our vision between present and future? How would the physical interface to keep the balance within the contradiction of possible and unimaginable?
Wow. I mean, take a while to answer that. I'm not even sure I know. It's a good question, really good question. I don't know. I mean, it's really in the first part of it is, they say that, anticipation is part of what makes us human, uniquely human, anticipating what's coming. I kind of see pasts and futures and presents in quite an atemporal way rather than a very linear way. So, and I think all of us do, we are zooming in and out of this atemporality throughout the 24 hours, dreams and ideas and planning a holiday to writing an email right now, so I don't think we need to say I do it between this at this point, it's really, it's quite ephemeral. Physical interface to keep, I don't know. I mean, I have to think about that one. Yeah, but good question.
The next studio project. Or investigation, sorry. Yeah. Okay, there is another one. How do you see the more than human perspective in regard to Buddhist? Then the last one, I don't know if I pronounce it right. Vedic,
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
It's interesting. I think there is definitely a spiritual side to it. It just kind of is not something I sought for. The current work we are working on right now certainly has a lot more spiritual aspects to it. And again, it has emerged, it has surfaced. And I think, so I'm not necessarily, I wouldn't put a religious label on it, like whether it's Hindu, Vedic or Buddhist, but I think a certain amount of spiritual kind of acknowledgement that we have a finite lifespan, that we are all here alive and we are all going to die, and that if we are able to weave death into our life in a way that feels more somehow cyclical rather than this linear. And it's very, again, tied in. It is tied into the idea of infinite growth. It is tied into the idea of progress. It's tied into the idea of the reasons we are where we are today is because of this holding on to this idea of infinite growth and progress. And if we let go of this, then we suddenly are in this void. But in this void is the chance to explore some of these other possibilities.
Yes, and I guess always in the big question is how to make the transition, right? How to make the kind of like really the systemic, big systemic changes, right? And so that's probably the biggest challenge of it all, I imagine, or also the lack of imagination too. No, I think that's
a big part of our work, actually. Yeah.
Also I was very interested when I was setting up the lecture series, and when I looked at your work, I was like, oh yeah, that would fit in, and like, oh yeah, that would fit in, oh, that would fit in. So it felt like I almost wrote the series a lot in a way about your work and how you operate. But I think that kind of the pessimism, the dystopia, which is somehow, I feel like, all prevailing also in popular media. It's way easier to imagine a grim, rainy world out there, or future out there, than something that might improve, even if it's one little thing.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of our work has been about cautionary tales, and I think the reason to talk about or to think about cautionary tales has been because they were almost like sort of early warnings of things that we really saw could be avoided or could be considered more carefully. But there's so much like reality is stranger than fiction, or this kind of what is it that Donna Haraway says, that this kind of distinction between science fiction and social reality is an optical illusion. And it's really, we are in that moment right now that we see this. So for us currently, the challenge is what drives us and what kind of are those beacons of hope that we work without making it into a shiny utopias, because they fail miserably, and I don't believe in shiny. I think every future is going to be messy and complex, and there are going to be winners and losers. It's just how much more equitable can we kind of explore, what are those boundaries.
Okay, and I think maybe if it's okay, one last question, because I see a raised hand, and I love the little blue raised hand. So, Yuli, please.
Yeah, also following up on the first question a little bit about like whom should we target. One of the things that we've experienced is that environmentalists does not have a clear vision. So if we're saying we don't have a certain person that we address, but we're still kind of like looking for like, where are we going then if we're criticizing whatever is out there? So where are we going? And I know that you're not trying to predict, but how do you feel about actually suggesting a way forward?
I mean, absolutely. Like, I thought that the whole kind of More Than Human field guide is one way forward. I couldn't imagine that not feeling like a way forward. It's asking us, all of us, to think about how we do things differently. And that's a huge part of going forward. If you're talking of very specific solutions to very specific challenges, there's also people who do really important work in that space. I think there's a lot of positive work out there, and I think it totally depends on what you're exploring and where you're heading. But I think there is room for solutions and critical thinking and explorations and all of that. I hope that sort of answers your question. I'm not going to give you direct answers because I think you are a designer, and you're a designer who wants specific solutions to specific problems. And I'm trying to get you to think not as in a very solutionist way, because solutionism, or kind of this hubris of being able to fix things very quickly, is also part of the problem. So I'm not suggesting that we don't come up with solutions, very much so, but what they are, and what, if you're going to put a dam over a river, it is useful and functional, but it will have repercussions on communities and on indigenous life and on many natural habits. So we just have to kind of understand the unintended consequences of what we are making.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
I mean, there is just one more that came up in the chat, which is asking about the cross-species communication and what's the best, how this might be addressed by design in the best way.
Yeah.
Is there a best way?
I don't know exactly, and I'm not even sure if it's core to my practice, cross-species communication. I think I'm not so interested in cross-species communication, actually. What we're interested in, like I said earlier, what does it mean to be human in a more than human world? What does it mean to continue living in this planet, bearing in mind that every single element or life on this planet has its own kind of has its own identity, and you know, has its own like kind of it's relational, and there's a relational agency between everything, and those relational agencies I'm interested in as much as I'm interested more in, rather than a kind of a I'm a designer and I want to kind of talk about cross-species communication, if that helps. So yeah, that would be sort of roundabout answer.
No, thanks, Anab. I mean, very inspiring, very inspiring. Not only to look at your work, but also, you know, to hear you speak about your work. Thank you again for the time. I would have loved to see your contribution at the Venice Biennale. Although it's postponed, I also imagine that the current situation might, you know, develop the work in a certain direction. So let's see what the contribution for the promised next year is gonna be. And I also very much hope that that there will be a time when we all gather at the Angewandte in the physical setting, starting to communicate cross levels in our building.
In a physical space. I miss the studio. I miss every single studio.
Yeah,
and human interactions. Yeah.
Yes, totally agree. That's at least hopefully that's something that we will notice in this time, that maybe that's the part of being human that we are not ready to let go. And to distance ourselves from each other all too much.
Definitely.
So Anab, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And
thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
you. See you.
Bye.